a church born from royal scandal, yet filled with deep spiritual mysteries. Today, we uncover the spiritual and political forces behind the creation of Anglicanism, one of the most influential and misunderstood Christian traditions in the world. It broke away from Rome, but never fully joined the Reformers. Its story is marked by kings and queens, persecution and prayer, hidden doctrines and surprising revelations. Behind its elegant liturgy lies a history of conflict, compromise and courage that shaped the soul of a nation and echoes through the global church today. So before we dive in, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and most importantly, drop a comment telling us what country you're watching from. It's always amazing to see how far this journey of faith reaches across the world. To understand the birth of Anglicanism, we must go back to 16th century England, a kingdom marked by political uncertainty and dynastic pressure. Sitting on the throne was King Henry VIII, a ruler known as much for his iron will as for his desperate longing for a male heir. His marriage to Catherine of Aragon, though politically strategic, had failed to produce a surviving son. As the years passed and hope faded, Henry's anxiety deepened. But this wasn't just a matter of royal succession. It became a matter of spiritual legitimacy. When Henry turned to the Pope in Rome to annul his marriage and was denied, a line was drawn in history. What looked like a royal scandal on the surface concealed something far more profound, a spiritual and political earthquake that would forever change the face of the church. Contrary to what many might assume, Henry VIII was no rebel theologian. In fact, he had once been awarded the title Defender of the Faith by the Pope himself for writing against the teachings of Martin Luther. But when the authority of Rome clashed with the ambitions of the English crown, Henry chose sovereignty over submission. In 1534, he enacted the Act of Supremacy, declaring himself the supreme head of the Church of England. In a single stroke of royal authority, the king took control not only of the state, but of the church as well. It wasn't a reform born from the pulpit, but from the throne. A new church was born, not in protest, but in power. Yet Henry's break from Rome was not just about marriage or even power, it was about identity. Beneath the political maneuvering was a deep desire to free England from foreign influence and forge a faith that was truly national. Anglicanism, from its very conception, was a church of tensions, reverent yet reforming, traditional yet independent, Catholic in form but English in spirit. This wasn't a theological revolution like Luther's or Calvin's. It was something slower, more calculated, and uniquely English. The Church of England retained many Catholic elements, bishops, sacraments, liturgical robes, but its soul had shifted. It bowed no longer to a pope, but to a crown. At first, the spiritual experience of the English faithful changed very little. The liturgy was still in Latin, the services still rich in ceremony, and the churches still filled with incense and stained glass. But under the surface, a new sense of religious self-determination was awakening. The clergy now answered to the monarch, not to Rome. Church lands and wealth were transferred to the crown. Monasteries were dissolved. It was as if the old body of the church had remained, but a new spirit had entered it, one that reflected the culture, the politics, and the heart of England itself. This dramatic beginning, forged in the fires of royal crisis and national pride, would shape the Anglican tradition for centuries. It was a church born not from a council of saints or prophets, but from a king's will and a nation's shifting soul. And yet, within that human drama, God was at work, crafting something that would endure, grow, and speak to millions around the world. Anglicanism would go on to develop its theology, refine its worship, and expand its reach. But its roots, they lie in a throne room, in a marriage denied, and in a choice that changed both crown and church forever. After the death of Henry VIII, the throne passed to his son, Edward VI, just a boy of 9 years old. But behind the child, king stood powerful Protestant advisors determined to guide the Church of England into deeper reform. It was no longer enough to simply be free from Rome. Now the question was, what would this new English church believe? It was during Edward's reign that the church began to develop its own spiritual voice, distinct from both Catholic ritualism and continental radicalism. And at the center of this transformation stood a quiet, brilliant man, Thomas Cranmer, the Archbishop of Canterbury. His legacy would be immortalized in a single volume that would shape Anglican worship for centuries, the Book of Common Prayer. But the Book of Common Prayer was not just a collection of prayers. It was a theological vision in poetic form, a vision of reverence, order, and accessibility. Cranmer believed that worship should be beautiful but understandable, sacred but not obscure. In a time when Latin still dominated church services across Europe, Cranmer's decision to write in English was revolutionary. He wanted every man, woman, and child to hear the gospel in the language of their heart. The prayers were crafted with poetic elegance, the rhythms familiar and comforting. Scripture was read aloud daily, and the sacraments were presented with clarity and reverence. It was a quiet revolution, not through protest, but through prayer. This commitment to balance gave birth to what would become a hallmark of Anglican identity, the via media, or middle way. Anglicanism would walk a careful line between Roman Catholic tradition and Protestant reform. It kept the structure of bishops and liturgy, but rejected papal supremacy. It honored the sacraments, but emphasized Scripture. It preserved the beauty of ancient worship while opening the doors of understanding to the common believer. The Church of England wasn't trying to be everything to everyone. It was trying to be faithful to both Scripture and tradition, reason and mystery, heaven and earth. Still, this middle way was not without its tensions. Some felt it didn't go far enough, demanding a purer, more reformed church. Others felt it had gone too far, lamenting the loss of Catholic unity. Yet somehow, Anglicanism survived these inner conflicts by choosing conversation over confrontation. Instead of building walls, it built bridges. It held space for difference, not by compromising truth, but by acknowledging complexity. Anglican theology was not rigid, it was reflective, and in this reflection, many found peace. This theological moderation allowed the Anglican Church to weather storms that would have shattered other movements. It didn't chase fads or fragment into countless denominations. It moved slowly, thoughtfully, with deep roots and open arms, and perhaps that's why, even today, millions around the world are drawn to its rhythm, a rhythm of tradition shaped by Scripture, sustained by prayer, and softened by grace. In a noisy world of extremes, the Anglican voice still whispers gently, calling believers to walk humbly, worship deeply, and think clearly. Just when the Church of England seemed to be finding its voice, history took a dark and painful turn. In 1553, Mary Tudor, daughter of Henry VIII and Catherine of Aragon, ascended to the throne. A devout Roman Catholic, Mary viewed her father's break from Rome not as a bold act of sovereignty, but as a heresy that had plunged England into spiritual rebellion. Her mission was clear: to restore the old faith, reunite with the Pope, and cleanse the land of Protestant influence. What followed was one of the bloodiest chapters in English religious history. Hundreds of reformers were arrested, imprisoned, and condemned. Fires were lit in public squares. And in the smoke of martyrdom, Anglicanism was tested not in theory, but in blood. Among those executed was Thomas Cranmer, the gentle architect of Anglican prayer. After years of imprisonment and psychological torment, Cranmer was led to the stake. Moments before the flames consumed him, he thrust the hand that had signed his earlier forced recantation into the fire, declaring, "This hand hath offended." His courage, even in death, echoed across the nation. He was not alone. Bishops, pastors, and everyday believers gave their lives for the new faith. These were not soldiers or revolutionaries. They were men and women whose only weapon was conviction, whose only rebellion was to cling to the gospel as they understood it. They died not in defiance, but in devotion. And yet, from this season of persecution, something powerful emerged. A deep resolve. Rather than crush the movement, Mary's violent campaign gave Anglicanism its first true martyrs, and with them a story worth remembering. When Elizabeth I, Mary's half-sister, rose to power in 1558, the tide turned once again. Elizabeth, politically astute and spiritually cautious, knew that religious unity could not come through force. Instead of swinging the pendulum fully back to Catholicism or forward into Puritan reform, she charted a course of balance. Through the Elizabethan settlement, the Church of England was legally established as a moderate Protestant church, retaining its bishops and liturgy, but rooted firmly in scripture and national independence. Elizabeth's genius was not theological innovation, but political wisdom. She understood that England was a patchwork of beliefs, some still loyal to Rome, others burning with reformist zeal, so she crafted a church broad enough to hold them together. Anglicanism, under her reign, became a big tent, a church of both ceremony and simplicity, of ancient hymns and new doctrines. It was a mosaic rather than a monolith, a church where high churchmen and evangelical preachers could kneel side by side at the same altar. And in that fragile unity, Anglicanism found its strength, not in conformity, but in coexistence. This season of consolidation was crucial. The Church of England was no longer just a political creation or a theological experiment. It was now a living body, shaped by suffering, refined by fire, and defined by its capacity to endure. Its clergy had faced death. Its people had worshipped in secret. Its prayers had been spoken in whispers and shouted from the pyres. And through it all, it had survived. Not because it was perfect, but because it had become part of the soul of the nation. A faith forged not in ivory towers, but in trials, in ashes, and ultimately in grace. As the Elizabethan Compromise held the Church of England together, a storm was quietly building within. Beneath the appearance of unity, not everyone was content. A growing number of reformers, known as Puritans, believed the English Reformation had not gone far enough. They looked at the vestments, the bishops, the prayer book, and saw remnants of Roman superstition. For them, true reform meant a purified church, stripped of tradition and ruled by Scripture alone. They didn't want to destroy the Church of England. They wanted to cleanse it. But the Anglican middle way, so prized for its balance, felt to the Puritans like dangerous compromise. And so, pressure began to rise from within the pews, yet some went further. These were the separatists, those who believed that the Church of England was beyond redemption. Unlike the Puritans who sought reform from within, the separatists broke away entirely, forming underground congregations where they could worship in simplicity, free from state control. Many of them would later board ships like the Mayflower, bringing their convictions to the New World. But in England, such defiance was seen as rebellion, not just against the Church, but against the Crown. Because in the Anglican structure, to challenge the Church was to challenge the monarchy itself. Faith and politics were still intertwined, and the consequences were growing. By the mid-17th century, these religious tensions exploded into open conflict. The English Civil War was not just a clash between Parliament and the King. It was a war over the soul of the nation. On one side stood royalists loyal to King Charles I and the hierarchical Church of England. On the other, parliamentarians, many of them Puritan in spirit, who saw monarchy and Anglicanism as symbols of tyranny. Churches were desecrated, priests were driven out. The Book of Common Prayer was banned in some areas, replaced by extemporaneous worship. And in 1649, for the first time in history, a reigning English monarch, Charles I, was tried and executed by his own people. The king was dead, and with him, the Anglican establishment was shattered. For a brief time, England became a Puritan republic under Oliver Cromwell, and the Church of England was officially dismantled. The nation was filled with preaching houses, plain worship, and austere living. But the Puritan dream proved difficult to sustain. Without bishops, without liturgy, without the familiar rhythms of common prayer, many began to feel a spiritual void. The desire for purity had led to fragmentation, and slowly, the longing for stability began to stir again. After Cromwell's death, the monarchy was restored in 1660, and with it, the Church of England returned to its former structure. Battered, yes, but alive. What this period revealed was a fundamental truth about Anglicanism. Its strength was not in rigidity, but in resilience. It had been broken apart by civil war, scattered by dissent, outlawed by radicals, but it endured. Not because it satisfied every side, but because it offered a center, a place where scripture could meet tradition, where governance could meet grace. The fires of conflict had tested its foundations, and still it stood. Weary, perhaps, but wiser. Ready to face the next chapter, not as a political institution alone, but as a spiritual home. For a people who had seen what happens when unity is sacrificed on the altar of extremism. As the British Empire stretched across continents, it carried more than flags and armies. It carried language, culture, and faith. The Church of England, once a national expression of Christianity, now began to take root in distant lands. Missionaries crossed oceans with the Book of Common Prayer in one hand and the Bible in the other. From the green hills of New Zealand to the bustling coasts of Nigeria, from the villages of India to the colonies of North America, Anglican churches were planted and communities formed. But what began as extensions of the English Church would eventually become something far more complex. A worldwide communion, bound not by geography, but by shared worship, episcopal structure, and a deep, though often strained sense of spiritual kinship. This global spread gave rise to what we now call the Anglican communion, a fellowship of autonomous churches, each shaped by its own culture, but linked by history and tradition. No longer just the Church of England, Anglicanism became a global tapestry of worship. Some churches leaned toward the high church, rich in liturgy and sacrament. Others embraced evangelical preaching and revival. In Africa and Asia, Anglicanism grew rapidly, infused with local music, language, and energy. In North America and Europe, it became a spiritual home for those seeking balance, a faith that could hold mystery and reason, scripture and sacrament together. The communion had become a mosaic of voices, but not without dissonance. Because as the 20th and 21st centuries unfolded, Anglicanism found itself in the midst of new battles, not with kings or popes, but within its own ranks. Questions around female ordination, LGBTQ+ inclusion, biblical authority, and cultural relativism began to strain the bonds of communion. Churches in the global South often held more conservative theological views, while churches in the West pushed for progressive reforms. Meetings intended for unity became forums of tension. Some provinces broke ties. Others tried to mediate. Once again, the middle way was being tested, not by war but by conscience. And yet, even in these tensions, something deeply Anglican remains: the refusal to give up on relationship. Unlike other movements that fracture quickly, Anglicanism has a peculiar patience, a willingness to sit in the discomfort of disagreement. It values listening as much as speaking, and believes that truth is often clarified in the struggle to understand one another. This doesn't mean there is no cost. Some divisions have cut deep, but the heart of Anglicanism continues to beat through prayer, scripture, and the Eucharist, through cathedrals in London and tents in Uganda, through silent retreats and spirited revival meetings. So where does Anglicanism go from here? Perhaps its future lies not in choosing a side, but in remaining faithful to its original calling, to be a church rooted in history but open to growth, grounded in scripture yet gracious in dialogue. In an age of polarization, the Anglican voice may be one of the few still calling for a table, big enough for questions, tradition deep enough for mystery, and a community humble enough to say, we are still listening. From a king's crisis to a global communion, the story of Anglicanism is far from over, and perhaps its most important chapters are still being written. The story of Anglicanism is not just about kings and bishops, doctrines and disputes. It's about the soul of a faith trying to hold together what so many others have torn apart. A tradition born from crisis, shaped by compromise, tested by fire, and now stretched across continents. Anglicanism has always walked a narrow path between Rome and reformers, between politics and prayer, between unity and truth. And yet, in every century, it has survived. Not because it had all the answers, but because it dared to ask the hard questions with humility. So we're left with this. In a world that demands quick decisions and sharp divisions, can a church still thrive by choosing balance over battle? Is there room today for a faith that refuses to choose sides, not out of fear, but out of faithfulness? Anglicanism may not satisfy our hunger for certainty, but maybe it invites us to a deeper table where mystery, tradition, and grace still have a seat. And now I ask you, what do you think? Should the church focus more on unity or on doctrinal purity? Let us know in the comments, and don't forget to tell us what country you're watching from. We love seeing this global community grow, one message at a time. If this video brought you new insights, be sure to like, subscribe, hit the notification bell, and share it with someone who's hungry for truth and history. And of course, join us in the next episode, where we uncover the forgotten movements that tried to reform the Reformation itself.